I hope the people in Karabakh will be able to stay in their own homes. I hope as many Azerbaijan refugees will be able to return to their homes as possible. And I hope that there should be a really working solution. I know it's not going to be easy. It may happen or it may not happen. But I think that's the only way.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of Faces of Armenia, we warmly welcome you to another special series on Artsakh. Our distinguished guest today, Dr. Ara Sanjian, is not only an associate professor of history at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, but also the director of the Center for Armenian Studies. But before we get started, allow us to add a brief note on the format. Our special series on Artsakh offers experts from a broad spectrum of disciplines a platform to share their perspectives and to reflect on Nagorno-Karabakh. By elevating their perspectives, we hope to add to the substance of ongoing discussions, strengthening mediating forces, both of which advance an unmistakable impetus to find and define an agreeable, timely, and hopefully lasting end to the war. We, Faces of Armenia, see ourselves as a bridge between Armenia and the international community, calling and enabling productive relationships and positive engagement. So, without further ado, dear Ara, if you could kindly introduce yourself, drop a word or two on your background, person, and personality, that would be kind.
I was born in Lebanon. My both parents are ethnic Armenians. My families are basically refugees to the Arab world from the region of Kilikia in 1921. This is when they left. And they went through a number of stages until both my mom and dad settled in Lebanon, or their families did. And they were, of course, that's where they met. And, I was born and I grew up. I studied in Lebanon until the age of 18. Then I studied in Soviet Armenia in the years of Mikhail Gorbachev. I got a degree in history from Yerevan State University in 1991. And then I studied for 3 years for my PhD at the University of London, the School of Orient and African Studies. Between 1995 and 2005, I taught in Beirut at Haigazian University. And since January 2006, I teach at the University of Michigan, Dearborn.
Thank you very much for this succinct summary to your person. And unfortunately, we came together for a rather grim topic. And we want to help our audience understand the historical context of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict better. So where to start? Can you really help us to move us from the Armenian genocide to the start of the Soviet Union?
Before the outbreak of World War I, as you know, Armenians lived on both sides of the Russian-Ottoman border, and the genocide occurred in the Ottoman part of historic Armenia, or the Armenian Highland, and even outside the Armenian Highland in many other parts of the Ottoman Empire where Armenians lived in significant numbers. Uh, uh, a, a significant part of those Armenians, over 100,000 maybe, I don't know exactly the number, actually or more, fled to Russian-controlled parts of Armenia as a consequence of the genocidal process. The issue of Karabakh, however, has more to do with the disintegration of the Tsarist Empire, and that, occurred in 1917, and especially after the Bolsheviks came to power in late 1917, when, of course, many peripheral areas of the Russian Empire, including the South Caucasus or Transcaucasia, as the Russians used to call it, refused to accept Bolshevik rule, except for the small region around the city of Baku. And then, of course, it took the Bolsheviks another 2 or 3 years to win the civil war. And it's only in the year 1920 that they were strong enough to push back into the South Caucasus, and gradually, within the space of 1 year, they forced Soviet system first on Azerbaijan and then on Armenia, and finally in February of 1921 on Georgia as well. So there was a brief period of political independence for these three republics between 1918, the middle of 1918, and anytime between 1920 and 21, depending on which of these three republics we are talking about. And essentially, the Karabakh problem emerges at the time when you have to divide the imperial territories between new nation states. And many areas in the South Caucasus were contested, some between Armenia and Georgia, others between Georgia and Azerbaijan, and others between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And of course, what is now Nagorno-Karabakh? At that time, it was simply called Karabakh, and its borders were not very clear. But the whole region of Karabakh was contested then between the Armenian Republic and the Azerbaijani Republic. And what is, of course, happening today is the continuation of that struggle, which basically was frozen by the Soviets for 70 years. But once power from Moscow got weaker, former rivalries emerged, and just as they were in 1917 to 1920, now they are also becoming very violent and bloody.
So I think what would be helpful for us to understand, the genocide against the Armenians were really a methodical act of extermination. So at the time of independent Armenia, First Republic, until the evolution or the start of the Soviet Union, what kind of people lived in this region, including Karabakh? How many?
Look, in one sense, Azerbaijan has entered the issue of genocide, and I don't know why. Essentially, today, Azerbaijan is a vehement denier of the Armenian genocide, and I may say even more forcefully than Turkey. While in Turkey, we see a certain group of people who are ready to admit that the policy of their government is wrong, and some of them, academics, a few of them have even written books about that period of the genocide, disagreeing sharply with what their government tells on the international level. In Azerbaijan, I know of no dissident Azerbaijani historian who actually says, what our government is teaching us is incorrect. So in that sense, and the fact that today the Turkish government is openly supporting Azerbaijan, and Recep Tayyip Erdogan is continuing the policies of the previous governments of denying the Armenian genocide, has actually brought these two issues to some extent together. And many Armenians think that essentially the fate of the Armenians in Karabakh can be very similar to the fate of the Armenians, like my grandparents, when they were forcibly put out of their own homes, violently, etc. And the area where they used to live for, centuries, at least, of course, was depopulated from its Armenian population. Now, coming back to your question, essentially, we have Armenian records from the 5th century. And at least from the 5th century, there is enough evidence that regularly there has been Armenian presence in this area, which is called Nagorno-Karabakh or Mountainous Karabakh. Of course, Armenians used to live before there as well, but essentially we have most of that period sources written in different languages. And we don't have that much information, but there is no reason to believe that Karabakh was outside the cradle. That is the area where the Armenian ethnicity emerged and developed. And we have evidence that Armenians lived in what we call now the Armenian Highland, at least from the 6th century BCE. And of course, this is the first written record, so probably they were there earlier. But then, of course, we have to enter guesswork about, because of the lack of written sources. But in any case, there is this idea that as borders changed, empires came and went. smaller, native independent principality statehoods rose and fell, Armenians always lived in that region. In time, of course, a Muslim element also appeared in the region, and gradually most of those Muslims, speak a Turkic dialect, which is, today's Azerbaijani, connected to the other Turkic languages in the world, and also in this case, like the Iranians to the north, most of the Azerbaijanis are Shiite Muslims. But we also know that Shiism is a latecomer into the region, and it was only under the Safavids, starting from the 16th century, that Shiism became a dominant religion in what is now Iran. And I'm not an expert on this, but I assume the same kind of Shiization happened in Azerbaijan at the same time. While the languages spoken in Azerbaijan is very close to the language spoken in Turkey, there are evident cultural markers, for example, which tie to some extent the Azerbaijanis to the Iranian world. For example, the Feast of Nowruz, or the New Year, celebrated every year in March, is very much celebrated in Azerbaijan, while in Turkey, at least I don't know in recent years, but until not so long ago, the government used to resent that because it was associated more with the Kurdish identity as such. So when we are talking about this, we have to take this into consideration. Now, when the autonomy for Nagorno-Karabakh was given within the borders of the Soviet in 1923, and the borders were drawn, the area had a population of just over 100,000, if I'm not mistaken, about 115,000 at the time, of which roughly 90% were Armenians, and the Azerbaijanis were around 10%. There was a small Russian element, and I think there are a couple of Greek villages, etc., in Azerbaijan as well. But overall, if we put those ethnic minorities aside, initially the difference was between so the difference between was 90% and 10%.
And to understand, of this 150,000, most of the 90% Armenians are direct survivors of the genocide.
No. They have been living there long before the genocide at all. As I said, we have monasteries like the one in Amaras, which in recorded history that it was there in the 5th century. For example, in recent years, excavations have been done near Askeran where they have found earlier shades of a settlement going back to the Hellenistic era. And so it seems that most of the people who lived there over generations did speak Armenian and probably did identify themselves as Armenian, etc. But we can at least talk about a continued presence of the population. The genocide in itself did not affect the Karabakh Armenians, and the genocide survivors that came to Eastern Armenia or the former Russian Armenia did not much settle in the Karabakh region. They settled in what is now Armenia proper, and a number of them went northwards into the region of Krasnodar in Russia, which is basically to the northeast of the Black Sea, where you have a very huge Armenian presence for generations, including many survivors of the Armenian genocide. Because in the Kuban region, Kuban is which is part of the Krasnodar area, there was fertile land where some of these refugees could be settled or could find a sense of opportunities of making a living over there. But as far as I know, none of them went into Azerbaijan. I know some families who ended up in Tiflis. Some of them later on came to Armenia, but among the Baku Armenians that I have met or have read about them, none of them are genocide survivors of 1950. If there are, there should be very, very, very few.
So I have to say, this is incredibly important to note, because by definition, if they are not survivors of the genocide, this is one of the oldest proofs of Armenians' presence in this region. This needs to be protected as a cultural reserve. This dates back into, as you mentioned, the Hellenic reserves.
Look, in recent years, and in recent means more actively since Azerbaijan became independent in 1991, like the rest of the former Soviet republics. And some seeds of it are there from the late Soviet era. There is a historiography in Azerbaijan which is claiming that there were no Armenians in Eastern Armenia uh, before the Russian annexation. That is entirely, of course, incorrect. But they are actually trying to exaggerate one element, which was that after the end of the 1828 Russian Persian War, there was an agreement between the two sides to allow people to migrate, and usually Christians migrated towards Russia from areas that would still remain under Persian control. And the opposite was true. And similar agreements were made between Russia and the Ottoman Empire a number of times during the wars of the 19th century. That's why we have, for example, Abkhazians, Chechens, and Circassians on former Ottoman territories, not only in Turkey, but also in Syria, in Jordan, etc. So in that sense, a few tens of thousands of Armenians actually moved. Maybe a few of them, and I have read that at least in 4 or 5 villages, you may have people in Karabakh. You could have people who have gone over there, but they were of course a tiny minority. But even in the case of the uh, Yerevan and its surrounding area, most of these people actually had been pushed out of those regions in the early 17th century by one of the by one of the Persian kings, Shah Abbas the First as well. So essentially, many of them were returning to the land of their ancestors. This idea that Armenians came as guests to that area, of course, is uh, very difficult to sustain academically. Although in Azerbaijan, I understand it's a very appealing kind of way, and that's the way President Aliyev talks. That's the way Azerbaijani government officials talk. Even some Azerbaijani academics talk when they talk to the outside world. But in that sense, it's not that Armenians migrated to Karabakh. Let's say Armenians migrating to the United States in the 19th century, with established country, and then of course not. But as you know, in empires, often ethnic populations are mixed. Yeah, and there was a certain kind of mixing of Armenians and Turkic-speaking Muslims. Let's call them Azerbaijanis because they started to be called Azerbaijanis in the 1930s. But definitely, those people were the ancestors of modern-day Azerbaijanis. And there was this mixing of the populations. And when you started to draw nationalistic borders in the era of nation states, etc., it was very difficult to draw such a line so that all members of one group will remain on one side of the border and the other. And so lots of contestation happened. Ultimately, we have to say that people over hundreds of years, there has been always popular migrations. There have been conversions. Sometimes we don't know how they happen because we don't know about those processes in the Middle Ages because there are not enough documentation, etc. But we can, for example, know that at certain stage, this or that group appears there, etc. And so we can know for sure what was the situation when the Russians came in. They really did a survey, and we can know, for example, how many of these people were already there before, how many of them came later on. And so all these numbers are beyond any reasonable doubt because the Russian censuses are reliable sources. And so you cannot actually make an argument the way that the modern Azerbaijani historiography is trying to do that. But it doesn't mean that in the whole area of Karabakh, especially outside the borders of NKO, there was also a Muslim Turkic speaking Azerbaijani presence, which had emerged over many, many centuries. So that's another thing. And the way the borders were drawn, it basically were drawn in such a way that the Armenians, because they would have some kind of an autonomy, they would be a very high percentage of them. And as I told you, it was about 90% when those borders were drawn in 1923. By the time when the Armenians under Gorbachev for the last time started to secede, that percentage of the Azerbaijanis had grown from 10 to 22%. So it was increasing. And in recent years, uh, apologists for the Aliyev clan, which has been ruling Azerbaijan since 1969. They say that Haydar Aliyev's one of his great services for the system was that he increased the number of Azerbaijanis in Karabakh. So, and that has always been Armenian fear that the Azerbaijanis will overwhelm them with sheer numbers and then say, no, we are the majority here and this land doesn't belong to you anymore. That's a very important leitmotif in all the Armenian actions and perceptions of what's going on in the Karabakh conflict. While the Soviets claim to the world that they have solved the nationalities problem, essentially they had suppressed any feelings of nationalism and not allowed those nationalism to actually find a real working modus vivendi amongst themselves. So essentially, it was only through Moscow's ability to use brute force, if necessary, that there was some kind of a peace.